This is Analytics with Asa, hosted on the FF Faceoff YouTube channel. Today, I'm joined with a good friend of mine and fellow analytics nerd, Colin Dunphy. How you doing, man?
Good, Asa. Thanks for having me. So glad to be back.
Absolutely. So I think a really fun way to kind of get this episode started is to talk about a mutual interest of ours, and that is fashion. And the guy who's kind of been blowing up on Twitter in the past few years is Derek Guy, the host of Die Workwear. And he's tweeted a lot about fashion and some interesting aspects of that. And so I think a fun thing to kind of connect fashion and football is to talk about maybe our favorite game day fits. So was there a specific player or outfit that came to mind whenever this question came up for you, a favorite game day fit of yours?
I love this question. I'm totally enthralled, or like with Derek Guy's account, and like reinvigorated by like learning about fashion and stuff like that. So it's consumed like the second half of the season. Like my football tweets like really fell off. My fashion tweets. So in light of like recency bias, like totally acknowledging that, I really like Jalen Hurts' fit when he played the Commanders in the NFC Championship game. It got some like Twitter love because I didn't realize that it was kind of like an homage to Michael Jordan when he showed up to one of his Final Four appearances, and I chose to wear it today. And I didn't even mean to do it. Like when I was getting dressed, I was like, oh, I'm like depressed. Like like Derek Guy talks about like using fashion as social language. And so I was like, yeah, I'm gonna put on like my dark clothes today. This is like, Monday, the day after the loss. And then as I was getting dressed, I had vision of Jalen Hurts' fit keep coming in my head. And I'm like, and so yeah. So I tried to like almost kind of recreate it today. That's why I chose to wear black kind of like knit shirt, and he wasn't wearing his blazer or his sport coat. It was kind of like a tan suit. And for anyone who's not watching, yeah, so it's like a black. He was wearing like a black loose fit top with a brown tan pants and like these really nice black leather loafers, which are totally in right now. And so yeah, that's why I chose this fit, and I can't. He's like rent in my head right now.
Yeah, and for everyone who's watching, we'll try to edit a picture of that fit to kind of give a comparison of what Colin's describing. I cheated a little bit, and the outfit that I think really spoke to the personality that I think you're looking for in a position is Terrion Arnold's draft day fit. So Derek Guy did a really long thread about this, but he wore kind of a single-breasted suit. And in my opinion, I'm not a big fan of like super slim fitting things just because it tends to just like really compress a silhouette. But I think he was someone who actually pulled it off effectively because like the white shirt that he was wearing underneath, I think it fit really nicely. The shoes were kind of matching properly. And I think the biggest thing about it is that it conveyed confidence so effectively. And that's really what you want for your cornerback. And so, as you mentioned, dressing is often a way of expressing social language. And so being able to convey confidence in your fits is something that was really effective to do as a cornerback. And doing that on draft day, many people's first impression of you, I think is something really cool. And, Terrion Arnold had kind of an up and down season as a cornerback, but I think being able to have that confidence, even if it's just in your dress, says a lot about you as a player. So yeah, that was a nice little fashion segment that we covered. But what I really wanted to talk to you about today was the fact that the season's starting to really wrap up. We have the Super Bowl right around the corner. But before we kind of talk about the Super Bowl, I feel like it would be a good idea to discuss the season as a whole. And so if you were to describe the momentum of the season, or how would you describe this season in just one word, if you could?
I have to go with thrilling. I was just thrilled throughout the season. At first, from the perspective of a Commanders fan, and more broadly, I mean, as I've gotten more into this, like I'm maybe less of a Commanders fan and more of a fan of football. So, like, I found myself just being really excited to watch football. I thought that passing was really exciting. So, like, EPA per pass went up to such that like 22 players had an EPA play better, EPA per pass better than 0. So it's like more average, better than average passers, I think, by like 2, so like as opposed to last year where it was 20. And that didn't even really include, it surely included Jayden Daniels, who, was like top 5 in most everything throughout the season. But it didn't even include Caleb Williams and like Drake May. So I think it's like a really exciting time to watch football with like, explosive plays coming from players, quarterbacks that aren't even like really performing that well. If that makes sense.
Yeah, this season, like there's so many different interesting storylines. I think one of the more interesting ones is just the effectiveness of the veteran running back. And I don't know if I can really describe that in just one word, but the fact that Saquon Barkley is setting records. You have Derrick Henry, who's in his 30s now and is also setting records. And you have Josh Jacobs, who was a free agent. You have Aaron Jones, who was a free agent. All of these guys were really effective with their new team. And I thought it was so interesting that we tend to treat running back as this kind of aging position that people throw away once they're past their rookie deal or maybe a deal after that. But just being able to see these guys go into their second or even third contracts and still be effective, I think says a lot about the things that we don't know about football yet. That, people tend to be very prescriptive about, this is exactly how you should run a team, or this is exactly how much you should pay a running back. But a lot of times that tends to kind of ebb and flow. I remember a good friend of mine who's also been on the podcast before, Jake Grossman, talked about how the size of players has changed recently, where there's defensive linemen who are smaller, there's linebackers who are smaller. And, I haven't done any statistical analysis myself in this topic, but it could be the fact that this difference in size may be why running backs have been so effective this year. And as you mentioned, quarterbacks have been effective even whenever they're just running the ball. And so there's so many different storylines to talk about, but switching forward to just talk about the Super Bowl, what was your favorite matchup to kind of research or look out for the game that's coming up next Sunday?
So, like I always like stating my bias. I've been digging into the Commanders more and specifically like early down rushing. Early down play calling, and so that's kind of where my perspective is starting. And I think that the Eagles have a surprising amount of reliance on Jalen Hurts' rushing on early downs. He had an EPA per play of like 0.11 on early downs versus Saquon Barkley, who has on early downs play of 0.02. So like much more efficient. It's a smaller sample size at like 93 rushes as opposed to like 300 something. But Saquon Barkley, I was kind of surprised to see that he wasn't as efficient or really as consistent in his success rate that I was expecting on like early downs. So he got a lot of his EPA per play, total EPA on late downs, 0.43 EPA on late downs with a 53% success rate, which, I think, it's probably going to be more explosive than consistent, like regardless of whether it's a rush or Saquon, Jalen Hurts. But I'm more or less trying to watch out for the explosive plays from Jalen Hurts as a rusher on early downs. And not to say that they can't win without that, but I think that's the thing I watch.
Yeah, there's so many different interesting matchups to watch. You have Vic Fangio against Andy Reid, Andy Reid's kind of gotten the better of Vic Fangio for some time recently, but I think probably the most interesting matchup is Jalen Carter against Trey Smith. So the Eagles for years now have had this kind of like Monstars cast of a defensive line where even in 2022, it was Fletcher Cox and it was Hassan Reddick, but now it's kind of switched to a younger group with Jalen Carter being in his second year. You have Nolan Smith in his second year, and they are just such a good team. Like the Eagles have one of the best rosters I've ever seen. And that going up against Patrick Mahomes is going to be such a fun matchup. But I think the micro matchup in there is the fact that the Chiefs have one of the best guard center guard combos in the NFL. Creed Humphrey is incredible. Joe Thuney, before switching out to left tackle, was a great left guard. And then Trey Smith, who's going to hit free agency this offseason, is probably going to get $23-24 million a year as a guard, which just speaks to how talented he is. And he's only 26 years old. But going up against Jalen Carter is going to be a really interesting matchup because pressure from the interior is one of those things that can single-handedly wreck a game. And Patrick Mahomes is one of the best in the league at avoiding sacks and turning those into positive plays. But it's still important that when you have a guy like Jalen Carter in your face, whenever you have Nolan Smith, who's insanely fast, like these are guys that can really wreck games. And I think while the Eagles defense has been really good, it's difficult to go up against playoff Mahomes. But just a few plays can single-handedly wreck that game. And Jalen Carter's been so successful this year at doing that. And so I think that is one of the more interesting matchups to see. I also think Trent McDuffie against Devontae Smith, if they line him up in the slot, is going to be interesting. But, moving past the narratives of, the Eagles have been here before, the Chiefs have been here before, I think we're kind of blessed to see a pretty interesting Super Bowl matchup. It's like the best roster against the best quarterback. And that just spells out some really interesting stuff to talk about.
I totally agree. Those are great points. It's we are really blessed, and I love the diversity and how you touched on, how we saw that through the year, with certain teams being able to be really effective with running backs, some of them free agents, and here we have the Eagles, probably the poster of that. So it's styles make fights and stuff like that. So I'm really excited, not just for the game, but all the breakdown afterwards and teams looking to them and seeing how they want to build for the roster.
Yeah, 100%. So I think we talked about matchups, but the fundamental matchup is going to be if Vic Fangio can stop the Mahomes offense. And so my question for you is, will Vic Fangio finally do it? Will he stop them enough to where the Eagles can score more points than the Chiefs? Who do you think is going to be winning this game?
Yeah, I just have to always go with Patrick Mahomes. I think that the Eagles might be on the right track. What comes to mind when I was trying to answer this question, with some data, I was reminded of a study on the difference between zone coverage and coverage in depending upon whether or not you're going against a really good wide receiver core versus a bad or average. And so a zone defense, what Fangio is using, split safeties, raise the floor. And whereas if they were to maybe use some more man match or straight up man kind of concepts, maybe that could raise the ceiling, provided they have the personnel to do it. So I would say individually, if it's just Vic Fangio, I'm less confident in that. They'll be able to meet the highs that Patrick Mahomes is likely to deliver. But with the improvement in personnel that we saw through the draft, these young guys, Cooper DeJean and Quinyon Mitchell, they're still ascending. They could have their best games ahead of them. And if they're put in a situation more man, they could potentially meet that level that to quiet Mahomes enough, right? But that, I don't know if that helps. But I'd still kind of bet against that just because they're younger. So I would feel more confident in that next year or the year after.
Yeah, I can't remember who it was. It might have been Trey Wingo, but he was describing instances where a team is tied or is trailing and they needed 7 points in order to tie or take the lead within, I think it was 2 minutes left in the fourth quarter. And in the playoffs, Patrick Mahomes has been almost perfect. And that's just crazy. The stat that blew my mind to kind of just recap a little bit of the conference championship game was that the Chiefs did not score 30 points all year except for against the Bills. It's mind-boggling because we put all this effort in to kind of quantify how good offenses are and how good defenses are. And the Chiefs, by many metrics, were not that great in the regular season. But it just simply doesn't matter. As long as you have Patrick Mahomes, as long as you have Steve Spagnuolo, and as long as you have Andy Reid, like that team will be a Super Bowl contending team essentially no matter what. And it's unbelievable to watch. Like they are so good. I don't know how sometimes, but they just always are.
It really makes me think of sample size. And, are we going to look at a smaller game sample or a larger game sample? And then, that came up big with Jayden Daniels. Like early in the year, I'm on like such an EPA kick. I'm like, he was leading the EPA play. So I was trying to lead that charge for him to be at least in consideration and talk. But I just kind of came to the conclusion that, the way people talk about the MVP race is with a sample size larger than one season. Like it's supposed to be kind of like one season, but I just don't think that's the case. I think and it's probably not a bad idea because with a low sample size, you could have somebody like Jayden Daniels becoming like a CJ Stroud or having that type of season next year. So I think there's a lot to say for increasing the sample size and weighing that first before you look at the current sample. And I think of that comes to mind when I think of like Patrick Mahomes in the playoffs. Like if you're not thinking about them at their fullest, capability, their fullest form or something, then you're not really weighing them appropriately.
Yeah, I think that touches perfectly into the next thing I wanted to talk about. And so with you being a Commanders fan, we've kind of seen this like rapid ascension of Jayden Daniels where he had kind of a rough first game, maybe an okay second game, but ever since then, he's been like incredible. And so how do you think that Jayden Daniels has managed to kind of outperform expectations? And, it's worth acknowledging being a second overall pick means your expectations are already going to be really high, and he's somehow exceeded those.
On that note, I mean, I love like the draft kind of outcome stuff and the contract stuff. So, if the way the Fitzgerald Spielberger chart is organized, the first pick is assumed to get 100% of the top five average of the top five contracts at their position when they are up for a new contract. And so you would expect them to like reset the market or become close to it. And like the second pick is like 80, I'm sorry, it's like 92 or something like 91%. Then you have like this range of outcomes that can come from that. Like that's kind of like the median, is that he would be at 91%. So like, I think I always tried to, in my mind, increase the possibility that the range that he could be much better than that. And like, so when he comes up for his contract, it would be like 105 or 110 or something percent, like in contract. Not that really works out like that when you're looking at contracts. But so that's kind of like my initial, was always my, like I tried to weigh that first before weighing other things. The way he performed with EPA per play, in terms of EPA per play, from the beginning of the season was very encouraging. A lot of it came from his legs. I mean, I remember in the first game, it actually, a lot of the production came when they were home. They were playing Tampa Bay. And so you could kind of like make the argument that that was some garbage time production. But for me, and you only have like one game sample, at that point, for me, the question was like, is that reproducible? And what I saw was that he was doing it with his legs, and his time to throw decreased. And I thought, so maybe you could say like the defense was, playing further back and gave him some empty yards. But I thought the way he was playing was reproducible. And I think EPA helped me kind of come to that conclusion quickly. And he continued, I think he improved over the next few games to the point where it's like, okay, this is actually kind of who he is. He is very effective with his feet. And when he's getting rid of the ball quickly, the offense is moving, it's staying on schedule. And, especially between like the 20 yard lines, like they can just kind of move the ball quickly and efficiently. And I think if we're just kind of going back to the question of like how did Jayden Daniels like overperform expectations, I think he was a better processor than I kind of assumed, and like better, less deficient over the middle than I think people might have thought. Like that was like a big problem, supposedly coming out of college. It was probably more like calling and like personnel, because he was able to do that in training camp, and we were being told by beat reporters that like that was something that was probably over exaggerated in his draft profile. So very quickly, I think he was better than advertised. Um, and then like I don't want to discount like the personal stuff. He has tremendous work ethic, is very calm under pressure, and I think that those are like really important things too. That like for me are hard to quantify and talk about. Like, but I totally think that's a big part of it as well.
Yeah, he throughout college had all of this upside. He was an incredible scrambler, probably the best in college since Lamar Jackson was. And he was great at throwing down the field. But you're right that the two big concerns was his ability to throw over the middle of the field and his ability to avoid sacks. And that was something that concerned me a little bit. And I'm by no means a draft expert, but it was just incredible to kind of see him overcome those things. So his sack avoidance wasn't incredible, but he was so good at turning negative plays into positive plays. And, he wasn't going to do the Michael Penix approach of avoiding sacks by just throwing the ball away, but he was always searching downfield. And you're right that as his time to throw kind of started to decrease, it was clear he started to understand how to process these defenses. And, one of the big stories that was talked about recently was his usage of the VR headset and how he would play games in 1.5 speed. And, it's difficult to probably quantify that sort of thing, but there's no doubt it helps. He was very insistent on bringing that from LSU to Washington whenever he was drafted. And I mean, it's clearly worked out. And Cliff Kingsbury has been someone who's run an effective offense. In the preseason, it was a lot of like screens, but he's kind of started to know how to effectively utilize those in early downs. And it just, all I can really say is the future is very bright for the Commanders. And they're not going to be in an easy conference with the Eagles still being really good, with a lot of younger teams starting to get a little bit better. Hopefully the Vikings soon if J.J. McCarthy pans out. But the whole point is they've definitely hit on their guy. And another thing worth mentioning is the fact that their free agents are going to be or their draft class is their cap space is very, very high. And so they have the ability to really cash in on these free agents that are coming up. So my question for you next is, where do you think the Commanders go from here? How do they improve, or how do they ensure that they don't get bounced in the conference finals if they end up making it there?
Yeah, so I'm going back to what I think might be their philosophy on how they want to play. And I think they want to run on early downs. They're not really necessarily trying to be successful, but they want to be consistent. So staying on schedule. Again, I think a lot of that came from Jayden Daniels rushing in terms of EPA, more successful and consistent than any other rusher on the Commanders. And I believe he has the highest EPA per play on of all rushers on likely rushing downs. I just put a tweet out about that. And so it's again a lower sample size than like Saquon, for instance, who has over 300 carries, India about 100 or something. But I would assume that he's still going to be a big part of their rushing success on early downs, but I would expect them to try and alleviate that with like adding more rushers, another rusher, or improving the offensive line. So that's philosophically where I think they might do that. in terms of like cap stuff and cash, like I'm huge on cash flow or like cash payments as opposed to the cap space, which is used to account for it. Uh, so cash is what ends up it's like kind of a limiting reactant that shapes rosters more so than cap space, save for like a couple teams in the league like the Saints that are really up against space. So um, I looked at if you go on over the cap, huge over the cap believer and intruder, they have a cash table which is only accessible on like your laptop. I can't get access. Maybe on Androids you can or something. But if your laptop and you click on cash under trends, you can see like that all the expected base salary and roster bonuses that are going to be going out in next year, and for next few years in future. The Commanders only have like $150 million on the cash of cash on the books, and like it's like bottom 3 in the league. So if they were to spend up to the level of the cap, they would have like $120 million more to spend, and they could very well spend like 220 if they choose. I don't expect them to, but like that's an option. So like in terms of where they go from here, I'm very curious to see how much they spend. And I think there's good arguments on both sides on like how aggressive you want to be in free agency or extending players on the roster now. Like what is the window you want to try and hit with Jayden Daniels, and things like that. So I think that is probably like something I'm going to be monitoring the most over the next few weeks and months.
Yeah, there's always been kind of a discrepancy depending on ownership on how much cash is spent versus how much cap space a team allocates. And so kind of the wealthier owners are able to guarantee more money because they can put it in the escrow account, whereas there's some owners who are not wealthy by owner standards. And so they're not able to put, $100 to $200 million in an escrow account to guarantee that. But I think this kind of speaks to the importance of ownership because there are some teams who are known for their competency. The Vikings are one of those teams who they hire the right people, they have state-of-the-art facilities, and then they kind of get out of the way. There's the Cowboys with Jerry Jones, who is great at ensuring that the team is always talked about and is very popular and very valuable, but he's also a little bit too involved for an owner by many people's standards. Prior to this season, the Commanders were kind of notorious for their ownership. And so, to kind of focus more on the positive, instead of talking about the Dan Snyder of the past, how do you think the new ownership has kind of changed that culture around the team? Do you think it's gotten significantly better by having the Harrises own it instead of Dan Snyder?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very encouraged by everything I've seen so far. Always kind of like trust but verify when it comes to ownership involvement and like where that line is drawn. And so like, by my accounts, what I've seen is, he has been hands off. He likes to be around, which I think can be kind of alarming, for some. But if the team people are okay with that, then like I don't have no problem with that either, It's like Tom Brady said some remark during a game, like, "Oh, I don't know if Dan Quinn likes the owner being down there before the game is over." And I mean, I have nothing really to say about that. It doesn't seem like that's a problem from anyone from the team side. Maybe like that's probably just Tom Brady like expressing his own concerns. So I think the biggest thing, and this will tie back into a point I wanted to say before, would be just the owner has the potential to increase the perspective, like the timeline on how you're going to be approaching problems, like solving them and like grading, your success. So I really like that. Like if we're focusing on process, we're increasing the timelines, we're being patient. I think you're going to get more results. And specifically that's the draft. Like that's where you have to build your league. Build your team in this league, not just for surplus value, but also access to good players, like best players at valuable positions don't ever hit free agency. So it's really hard to understate the importance of the draft. And to kind of like buoy that point, the Commanders only have 13 players on rookie contracts that they drafted on their team right now, or for the 2025 season, out of 34. So like they have a very depleted farm system, let's say. And I think so that last year, I think that kind of increased the variance on what the outcome could be, because they have all these people coming in, and we don't know if they're going to be, let alone good this year. Like some free agents don't do well. A lot of them, I think, probably do as well as their contract for the first year or two. I think GM pretty good at like evaluating talent. But like the more players you have, the more often you do that, the more times you're just rolling the dice. It's like I'm rolling the dice 10 times. Last year, like it seemed like they all came up good. You know what I mean? We don't know if that's going to be the case this year. And until they are able to like add rookies that will like be more dependable and get better, like there's always going to be a lot of variance, I think, like a wide range of outcomes, like for the next year or two.
No, I think that's such a good point. And especially with the ownership aspect, it's so true that really incompetent or irrational owners tend to just fire people really quickly if things aren't great immediately. And that tends to lead to a lot of GMs and coaches making these kind of short-sighted decisions that, obviously are bad trades, but they help you out in the short term. They help you ensure that you're not going to get fired this year. And instead, maybe you'll get fired next year or the year after that. So like the team that really comes to mind is the Eagles, where I think it was Brad Spielberger that brought this up, but Howie Roseman's job security is such an advantage because he can make these trades with teams 2, 4, 5 years down the line. And he knows that he's going to be the one to cash in on those trades because he has such a secure job. Whereas there's these other owners. I remember whenever the Bears traded for Justin Fields, they sent a lot of draft capital for that. Or whenever there's all these teams that tend to overpay for players. The Jets, whenever Woody Johnson's owning the team and they pretty much expect Aaron Rodgers to kind of save their franchise. Like these are short-sighted moves that at the time may be a bit understandable, but it's clear in the long run, it's not going to help you out that much. And so having the owners that are not only patient, but kind of hands off, knowing, hey, things may not be great right now, but in the future, things are going to work out. And this is kind of what I was expecting the Commanders to be like this season, where the process was very clear that they were going to be better throughout the rest of the few seasons, but things may not have been great right now. Little did I know that Jayden Daniels would be like a top 8 quarterback right off the bat. And that just speaks to how good he is. And the Commanders are going to get him cheap for the next 4 years, which is awesome. And so it's awesome how that timeline has kind of sped up a little bit, but it's bought the owner, it's bought the GM, it's bought Dan Quinn kind of some leeway where if things don't work out right away, I think the owner will be a little bit more understanding of the process that's going to happen, because it's going to be difficult to replicate an NFC championship run. Like only 2 teams make it there every year. But I think it just speaks to the talent that the Commanders have on their roster right now. And the fact that they have all this free agent cap space just speaks to, I think, the fact that their future is really, really bright.
Totally agree. Great points.
So we've kind of touched a little bit on EPA. And for those who aren't aware, EPA is kind of like yards with context. And you can definitely add to this definition in a bit. But, you were one of the primary reporters of EPA. I remember always seeing the Jayden Daniels EPA is this high this year. And so how do you think that EPA has kind of guided your opinion on what makes a successful offense or defense?
Yeah, well, thank you. Really appreciate your following and action on Twitter and stuff. I leaned into EPA a lot more this year with just wanting to follow through with like the stuff we talked about in our podcast, and the stuff that I've been learning. So every week I would post like EPA per play, success rate, and I would, if I had time, I would try to come back and add the PFF grade as well, because it's like a different perspective, like the pressure sack rate. For me, like I kind of want to start answering this question with Sam Howell. I like as a Commanders fan last year, 2 years ago now, I guess, the thing was Sam Howell and like this potential that a 5th round quarterback could save us, and he had this arm and was putting up some yards, and I think early on the season a lot of fans were really impressed, but all during that time his EPA per play was around 20, and there was like this one, I'll never forget it, like Eric Eager, back when we were so lucky to have him constant, or, like as an active member on Twitter, was like, oh, it was something like Sam Howell's a great backup quarterback or something. And it drove like all of like the Commanders fans nuts. And I was just sitting there like, really going through it, like, I'm like, this is why I'm still a fan. But he was right, he was obviously right. And as the sample size increased, we were able to see that Sam Howell just didn't do a very good job of adding the yards that mattered, the yards that gave him first downs, increased opportunity to score, and thereby like putting, giving the Commanders a chance to score. And of course, really, I should also, include like the offense, the play calling, to the extent that it's a team stat. I think they're all team stats. But I think to that extent, like EPA per play helped me prepare me as a fan for the fact that Sam Howell wasn't going to be very good. And when Jayden Daniels came along, it was like, it prepared me for the fact that he's going to be better than I think people were expecting. So very early on in the season, I was impressed. And I think a lot, like there is still the sample size consideration, because, I'm thinking back to like 3 or 4, and, there was still a possibility that that production could decline. But I think where you can, where maybe I got lucky or something, might be like just the ground, like his effectiveness on the ground. I think, over the past few years, we've seen the importance of EPA that coming from scrambles. I remember like last year, Ben Solak did something while he was with the Ringer about, like the average EPA scramble was 0.5 EPA. So I was at the time like tracking Sam Howell's EPA, and I'm like, oh, can he cancel out the EPA on scrambles that he loses on sacks? And this was actually in my interview with Tage. It got cut. It just didn't really fit into the final edit. Because but it was interesting because like when Tage Seth was at Michigan, he did a paper with Joe DeCresh, and they came to the conclusion that the EPA gained on scrambles is not stable. And so like I walked away from that thinking, the EPA lost on sacks is important. Like it's going to be difficult to cancel them out with your scrambles. But then where that brings us to here is like, I just don't think Jayden Daniels, the quarterbacks in that study didn't have Jayden Daniels capabilities. So when he comes in early on in the season and is gaining EPA, especially in the 20s, and because like they were able to pass a lot between the 20s, and then once they got into the red zone is when they ran a lot. Like the pass rate over expected switched, it was like very high pass rate over expected between the 20s, and then a very low pass rate over expected once they got into the red zone. So yeah, I mean, I was just super impressed by his ability to gain EPA. You know, Daniels. I'm probably gonna start rambling at this point because like he was so amazing at it in college as well. I mean, he was like an EPA king. And I think like if we're talking about like the uncharted part of the game, there's something about just quarterbacks being able to find something where there is nothing, and like that's a positive game. That they're putting their team closer to first downs. They're increasing scoring position chances, and they're getting EPA, and that skill just seems to be translatable, in my opinion. Like in large samples. I need to like, keep calling that. And so like whether it's through that like conflict that quarterbacks like a quarterback like Jayden Daniels is able to place defenders in. I think probably especially on rear downs, they're most worried about his ability to run is when he's most able to leverage that threat into passing better. So like his EPA per pass went up on in likely pass situations when you would kind of like expect the opposite. Like a lot of times it's harder to pass in likely pass situations, but he seemed to have a better EPA per pass. And so it's just finding ways to increase or to like leverage his abilities to be the most efficient as possible, gain EPA way. Like there's lots of ways of doing it, but like I'm just kind of like, I guess I'm amazed at like the ability of a running quarterback to place defenses in conflict and make them just give up EPA. They just like hand it over. So that seems.
Yeah, it's just like pretty much the best case scenario in almost all of his outcomes has been what's happened in his rookie season so far. And I think you bring up CJ Stroud as an example of where, when really high expectations occur for rookie quarterbacks when they're going into their sophomore season, like there were some concerns with CJ Stroud where his turnover worthy plays were a little bit higher than the interceptions led out to be his rookie season. And then it kind of regressed back to the mean this season. But like Jayden Daniels, it's almost like if you just look at the counting stats, he's been pretty good. But if you look at all of the advanced stuff, like you said, the yards with context, the EPA, the success rate, like all of these things have been better than what the counting stats have kind of alluded to. And I think Sam Howell's kind of that perfect example where just because you throw for a lot of yards does not mean you're a great quarterback. And Sam Howell took a lot of sacks. He threw a lot of interceptions. He was not good at getting yards when they mattered. And Jayden Daniels has just been kind of the antithesis of that. He's been better at avoiding sacks recently. His time to throw is much lower. Like he's just been so good. And like we could talk about that all day. But I think one of the interesting things about EPA is kind of how it's been used more recently. And how do you think that our media literacy has kind of changed in using EPA? Like for one, I think it's really cool that you actually hear EPA being used by a guy like Ben Solak for ESPN instead of it just being, the dark corners of Twitter for people who like EPA.
I totally agree. And I love this question because I really think. And so, we talk, like, what are we comparing EPA to? Like, so instead of EPA, I think people usually just talk about like yards. Like, oh, he threw for this many yards, and so you're like just accumulating stats. And we know that I always bring like Redskin Commanders, metaphors. And so Kirk Cousins was like really good at getting empty yards too. Darn it, where was I going with this? Yeah, so when you're talking about like accumulating yards, it's devoid of situation. But when you're talking about like EPA, we're talking about accumulating yards with context with like situation in mind. So it's based off of situation. So like we're saying all these We know yards aren't equal, but we're putting them into a context based off a situation where they kind of are, and that, so then you're like, oh, okay, well then, he's got this much EPA per play, and I just think that already, from a frame of reference, like places you more aware of the situation in which that production took place, and like just like the situationality of yards, I think that awareness goes so far. And then like to take that one step further, I feel like once you a lot of people that talk about EPA per play are very likely to bring up success rate, like soon after, and because they work so well together. And I think success rate works well with normal yards too. I mean, like success rate's been around, since 1987 in the book The Hidden Game of Football. Bill Walsh talked about it a lot in the 90s. It's nothing new, but like it just seems it kind of ups, like there's like an ebb and flow. I feel like we used to hear more about success rate in a yards context a long time ago. I have vague memories of that when I was a kid, but I guess that would be the biggest thing. So like just the situationality of EPA and as opposed to yards is really important to like put that into like mind. And then like how quickly can you start talking about success rate? Because that's a big part of what coaches are trying to do. Some want to be consistent, and some want to be explosive or in the middle. Yeah, like at the end of the day, all of this stuff, I think I might have said this on your last podcast, but like the analytics and stuff, it just helps me understand what they're trying to do. I thought at one point when I was getting onto this, like, oh, I'd find like maybe there's one way to do it, and like that's the best way. At this point, like I just think that was probably wrong. And I like EPA because I think it gets me closer to thinking about what it is they're trying to do.
Yeah, I think you touch on this point perfectly, because I think in our heads, we tend to already place value in different types of yards where, yards in the red zone are more important. But EPA is just a way of actually making that objective. And that's kind of like the main utility of analytics to me, is that a lot of times we like to add context to situations on whether or not we should go for it on fourth down. And analytics is just a great way of being able to actually like make these measurements objective, instead of it us trying to kind of do these mental calculations in our head that probably are not accurate. And I think that's really the main benefit of EPA. And it really has kind of borne out in the fact that Jayden Daniels had a really high EPA all year, and the points that he scored earlier in the season were not as high as the points he scored towards the end of the season, because EPA is just a better predictor of points, something that you talk about in your Twitter, which I thought was really cool. And so it's like, I think we've just gotten so much smarter as fans because we've been able to kind of like wrap these analytics into our dialogue. And, I yearn for the day where we hear it a little bit more often on ESPN, but you have actual reporters who are regularly reporting about analytics and about these objective measurements, that I think is such a cool thing that makes the sport so fun to me. And, at the end of the day, like games are played on the football field, but the way that we watch those games is not just with our eyes, it's with numbers. There's people that will just look at the back of football card stats and argue that this player is better using yards or using touchdowns. And I think we're starting to get smarter to kind of move past that. I think, wow, that's really helpful. It's kind of gone wrong recently, at least in a lot of people's perception. And that is the Ben Solak controversy. So Ben's a guy who I like a lot. His content's great. But in the AFC Championship game, he used the player tracker dots to kind of argue that Josh Allen should have thrown it to Khalil Shakir on the orbit screen. So he's kind of come under fire recently because of that. Given all of that, do you believe that these kind of player tracker dots and stuff still have utility in today's game, whether that be for analytics, coaching, or media?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I'm listening to coaches, and I love listening to coaches, I always try and want to like bring their philosophy into my frame of reference. And I feel like they always talk about how we play a numbers game. We're counting numbers in the box. And then, it's also about space, um, creating space, compressing space. Um, so I think there's probably nothing better than that than pictures, and pictures with dots on them. That I can like really clearly say, you know, like, oh, that dot is further from this dot. They're looking at all that space that's created, you know, on purpose or whatever. Like there's a story in the dots and how they move. So no, I think it's probably just getting started. What I think might happen, I'm reminded of a book called Capology, written by Dub Maddox, and it's not the salary cap. I got it, and what is it? Just kidding. But it's from a defensive perspective, you know, talking about how to cap routes. And so you know, is a route capped or not off of, you know, the defensive alignment, pre-snap, post-snap, you know, like at the catch point, where and that has to do with like the distance between these dots, if you will, but also like the orientation of like their hips and like their eyes, and because that like really has a huge impact on whether, like, just because the dots are close to one another doesn't mean that they're like interacting, you know. If it's going to take a long time for one person to turn around and stuff. So we saw some of that with in a play that Jayden Daniels made to, I think it was Terry McLaurin. There was some analysis where basically the defender in coverage was pretty close if you're just looking at dots, but like the defender was looking away from Terry McLaurin. So Jayden Daniels was able to exploit that leverage. And yeah, I think like the dots, once they are able to account and display like the hip orientation and like, or maybe the eyes, then you'll get more use out of it. And that won't be long, you know, like we're just touching the iceberg with that.
This is super off topic, but I promise it kind of relates. Did you ever play the original Metal Gear Solid?
Yes, Snake.
Okay, so yeah, exactly. So it's like in my head, I think maybe a better interpretation of those dots would be kind of the cone of vision that's used in that game. Because I don't know about you, but like whenever I play Metal Gear Solid, a lot of times I'm playing the game almost exclusively looking at that little map in the top right corner because it displays the cone of vision. And so, you know, it's not going to account for hips, but I almost think that being able to use the cone of vision to indicate which direction the player is pointing in would be a better way of like looking at the game more objectively. Because I think the biggest source of controversy this past weekend was the fact that Ben Solak said Josh Allen should have thrown it to Khalil Shakir in that little orbit route. What people were upset about is the fact that Josh Allen was being blitzed and he was facing the opposite direction of Shakir. So, you know, it's easy to look at the dots and say, hey, this guy's wide open, but he's not really pointed in the right direction. So, you know, this is just a suggestion, but I think if we could somehow indicate which way a player is looking based on that cone of vision, it could maybe, just maybe, be a better way of kind of accounting for what a player maybe should have done based on, you know, the dots and their orientation.
That's a great idea.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, Colin. This was a great time talking about fashion, Jayden Daniels, Super Bowl, and kind of everything in between. Where can the viewers find your work?
I'm still on Twitter at MofoPod, MoFoPod. It stands for Middle of Farm Open. Farm here in Maryland, the chestnuts and pawpaws. And I do a Balkan Chestnut Festival every October. With Balkan music and chestnuts. I'm also on Blue Sky at Colin Dunphy. I'm trying to move over there more, but you know, it's kind of like a here and there thing. So my website is also back up. It's mofopod.com. It's a lot that I've, you know, kind of like added to, you know, here and there over the past few years. So Really appreciate coming on your podcast, Asa. I love the work that you're doing and where you're growing with this and going on YouTube now. So yeah, it really means a lot to me. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And this is Analytics with Asa. Thank you for listening and watching.